Welcome back to the Steve Malzberg Show. I'm Joe Concha, filling in for Mr. Malzberg. Congress heads back to work on Monday, and the first order of business, they're going back to work on Monday, meanwhile. How long of a vacation do you need? I take 4 days off and I lose my mind. They've been off since, like, I don't know, what, June? Good Lord. Anyway, the first order of business will be dealing with all President Obama's foreign policy and domestic woes. To get a preview of what is in store for the President and Congress in the coming weeks, I am joined by Newsmax White House correspondent John Gizzi. John, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Joe. Always a pleasure.
So, John, I want to get your take first on it. The President just left Estonia. He's now in Wales. Obviously, there's a lot of issues on the plate right now, specifically ISIS. Let's kick off with that. It seems like we're getting mixed messages, whether it's Chuck Hagel from the fence, whether it's John Kerry, Secretary of State, whether it's Joe Biden and the President. It seems like no one's talking to each other and getting out a coherent message. How do you see it?
Well, let's say this. I'd be dishonest with you, Joe, if I didn't say I've heard that before on Capitol Hill. It seems that one day the President will say ISIS is junior varsity and cannot compare to Al-Qaeda. And then his Secretary of Defense says in no uncertain terms they're a major threat. What I find is this, that they are on the verge of achieving their goal of being a terrorist petro-state. They actually are governing several major cities, including one with a population of 550,000, in many places leaving in place the secular government that was there in Iraq earlier. ISIS is not only a threat, as we see in what happened to the two journalists, the two tragic scenes, but we're also seeing that they're becoming a clear and present danger and living up to their name as the Iraqi and Syrian Islamic State. It exists already and it's functioning, and that is something that we're going to have to deal with. And I'm not even beginning to mention the fact that the oil refineries in the northern part of Iraq, in many cases, are being operated by ISIS itself.
John, isn't this worse than, say, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan? Because they didn't have access to all this money, all these weapons, all these oil fields. It seems like this is Al-Qaeda on steroids. And I'm a media guy first, more than anything else. So let me ask you one question. I always hear the President refer to them as ISIL, not ISIS. Is there a subtle difference that he's hoping to make here to somehow tamper down the threat that they are, or the fact that they're in Syria? In other words, explain to me the reasoning behind going ISIL instead of ISIS.
Well, I was talking about this with several other White House correspondents at the last briefing by Press Secretary Josh Earnest before the President went overseas. ISIS is what its name says. The acronym is Iraqi and Syrian Islamic State. The ISIL, the L stands for Levant, which is in essence a greater state that includes Jordan, Syria, and what is now Israel. So ISIL would be the big picture, or to borrow a phrase from you, Joe, ISIS on steroids. The President says ISIL. His spokesman says ISIL. The Associated Press says ISIL. Other people say ISIS.
I'd venture to guess, too, if you were to go ask 100 Americans in the street right now what ISIS or ISIL stands for, I would say all 100 probably wouldn't know. So why even bother going through with that difference? But, you know, go figure.
Well, it's important.
It is, isn't it?
Yeah.
You wrote a great piece about what Obama could learn from Estonia, of all places. That's where he just came from. It seems like the Tea Party, or at least the mindset, exists in Estonia's government in terms of spending. Expand on that for me a little bit.
Well, it's not just existing, it's governing and it's working. And that, according to an American economist, Dan Mitchell of the Cato Institute. At the very same time that this country was instituting a $700 billion plus stimulus package in '09, Estonia, which was faced with debt and the early effects of the Great Recession in Europe, went the opposite direction. They did not borrow money or go into debt. They froze pensions for retired government employees. They froze, or they cut, the wages of government employees by 10%, and they made true austerity come to life with major cuts. And guess what? In 2011, their economy was growing 7.3%, and currently the country is one of only 4 NATO members that lives up to the promise in its charter of 2% of GDP for defense. It's called the Silicon Valley of the Balkans, and it's considered one of the best locations in Europe for the IT business. Job creation is growing and the economy is growing, all because they bit the bullet for 2 years.
Wow.
And made the cuts we wouldn't make.
7.3%. We do jumping jacks and we get to 3% here in the States, so that's
Right.
just remarkable. Hey, we got about a minute and a half. I just want to mention one other piece as well. As far as Ukraine signing a ceasefire with pro-Russian rebels, you know, I hear this and I say, boy, that means we have to trust the ceasefire. That means we have to trust Vladimir Putin. How do you see eventually the whole Ukrainian-Russian thing working out? Will Ukraine actually be absorbed by NATO, which would be, you know, obviously a big deal for the United States because we'd actually have to defend them under that charter. But if Russia goes in and stays there like they did with Crimea, I mean, don't you see that as the more likely outcome given everything we're seeing to this point, despite this ceasefire?
You heard it here first. I've talked to some pretty responsible experts on that part of the world, and they point out that all the time there was talk of a ceasefire. That was a complete canard. Tanks were coming over the border at that point in areas such as Donetsk. There was combat and there was evidence of Russian-backed soldiers and weaponry being used. And the betting among Ukraine watchers and people who've been to the country is that Russia will simply not give up on expanding its hegemony to eastern Ukraine. And from there, they can pick a fight with Moldova or other parts or any other country that has a Russian ethnic population. I really recommend to all of our viewers, Joe, that they read President Putin's March 18th speech, in which he said that Russia has the right to intervene on behalf of ethnic Russians anywhere. And that means people of Russian descent living in sovereign countries.
I want to talk to you more about that, John, when we come back. And Newsmax White House correspondent John Gizzi will join us again after the break. But first, stay tuned for your Newsmax Now update.